I was always scared of the stories my older cousins told even though I never showed it. The way they talked about ghosts and monsters felt too real, and the way they laughed when I looked nervous made it worse. I was 6, old enough to know they were teasing but too young to shake the feeling that maybe they weren't just making it up. Especially at night, when every creak in the house sounded like something was coming for me. They loved to make me feel small, though. Whenever we visited Grandma's house, it seemed like their favorite game was to tell me about the spirits that haunted the place. The ones who hid in the closets or under the bed. They said if I was ever awake past 10 p.m., the ghosts would know, and they would come out to take a peek at the kids still awake. I hated it, but I couldn't stop listening. My fear always felt bigger when the sun started to set. The house felt too quiet after dark, and the shadows in the corners looked like they were watching, waiting. That evening I had to walk with them after dinner. Grandma asked us to go to the store for milk, and I didn't have a choice but to tag along. The sun was already sinking behind the hills, leaving streaks of orange and purple across the sky. I tried not to think about what they might say, but as soon as we were a few blocks away from the house, the teasing started. "Hey, did you know about the room in Grandma's house?" my cousin Jeremy asked. He was 12, old enough to know better, but he grinned like a shark ready to pounce. I shook my head hoping he'd stop there, but I wasn't that lucky. "Yeah, there's a ghost in one of the rooms," he continued. "It only shows up after 10. Grandma's talked about it before, didn't you hear?" "Shut up, Jeremy," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. But my other cousin Ellie piped in. "No, he's right. It's true. The ghost only shows up for kids who are awake between 4 and 8 years old. And guess what time it is?" Ellie said, pulling out her phone. She made a show of checking the screen, her eyes widening. "Oh no, look. It's already 22:10. I froze. When Ellie said it was already 10:10, something inside me shifted. My stomach clenched so hard it felt like I might throw up, and my legs started shaking before I could even stop them. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, trying to hide it. I didn't want them to see how scared I was. They'd just make fun of me more, call me a baby, or worse, tell everyone how terrified I was of some dumb ghost story. So, I bit my lip and forced myself to take slow, shaky breaths. I kept my head down, hoping they'd drop it soon. But the whole way back to Grandma's, I could barely hear their voices over the rushing sound in my ears. The sky had darkened completely now, and every house we passed looked like a shadowy silhouette, their windows black and empty like eyes. My skin felt cold despite the warmth of the summer night. Jeremy and Ellie were still chatting and laughing, oblivious to the panic swirling inside me, as if the story they just told me was nothing but a joke. But to me it wasn't. It felt real. Too real. By the time we got back to Grandma's house, I was gripping the door handle a little too tightly, my knuckles white. The house was quiet when we stepped inside, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the hallway. Grandma was in the living room, knitting something by the fireplace, her rocking chair creaking softly in rhythm. "You're back just in time, dears," she said warmly without looking up. "Jeremy, Ellie, you two will share the guest room tonight. And you, sweetie," she added, looking over at me, "you'll sleep in the smaller room. You remember it, right? The one at the end of the hall?" I froze. My heart sank as her words registered. The small room. That was the room. The one Jeremy and Ellie had been talking about. The room where the ghost supposedly showed up after 10 p.m. for kids my age. I wanted to scream, to protest, to say no, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight like it was closing up. I just nodded, unable to speak, and Grandma smiled softly. She had no idea. None of them did. After brushing my teeth and changing into my pajamas, I walked slowly down the dark hallway. The wooden floors creaked beneath my bare feet, each sound echoing louder in the silence of the house. The small room was at the very end, and even though I'd stayed there before, tonight it looked different. The doorway seemed darker, like it was swallowing the light from the rest of the house. I hesitated outside the door, staring at the doorknob, my hand trembling as I reached for it. I couldn't let them see I was scared. If they knew, they'd never let it go. So, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was simple like always. A small bed against one wall, an old wooden dresser by the window, and a single lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows across the floor. But tonight, those shadows seemed to move like they were alive, creeping along the walls. The air felt thick, and every tiny noise made me jump. The soft rustle of the curtains, the distant creak of the house settling, the faint hum of the wind outside. It was just past 11 o'clock when I finally crawled into bed. I lay there, stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that there was no ghost, that Jeremy and Ellie were just messing with me. But no matter how hard I tried to calm down, my heart wouldn't stop racing. Every tiny creak in the house sent a bolt of panic through my chest. By midnight, I was drenched in sweat, my whole body shivering under the covers even though the night was warm. A fever had started creeping in, making everything feel distorted like the room was spinning around me. My head throbbed and my throat felt dry. I wanted to get up, to run out of the room and into Grandma's comforting arms, but I couldn't. I had to stay. If I left now, they'd know I was scared. They'd know I wasn't brave enough to face the night alone. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. I counted backwards from 100, hoping it would calm me down. 100, 99, 98, but it didn't help. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind outside the window seemed louder, closer. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, casting strange, shifting shapes on the walls that looked like twisted faces. I kept telling myself it was just shadows, just the wind, but the more I looked, the more they seemed to move on their own. At one point, I thought I heard a faint scratching noise coming from the closet. My heart pounded in my ears. I told myself not to look, but my eyes kept drifting towards it. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for a crack of darkness to seep through. The scratching grew louder, like something inside was clawing to get out. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, squeezing my eyes shut again. It was just past midnight now and my fever was getting worse. My skin burned and my body wouldn't stop trembling. I tried to calm myself, repeating over and over, "It's just a story. It's not real." But deep down I wasn't so sure anymore. I could feel something watching me, something just beyond the edge of my vision. Suddenly there was a soft creak, like the floorboards shifting under the weight of something heavy. I stopped breathing, my heart hammering in my chest. It came again, closer this time, like footsteps slowly approaching the bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The room felt colder, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. The shadows on the walls seemed to pulse, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring, but I refused to close my eyes again. I stared at the ceiling, my body locked in place as the footsteps drew nearer. And then, they stopped. Right next to my bed. I don't know how long I lay there, my body shaking, my breath shallow and quick. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. My head was spinning, my fever raging, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. I fainted. The last thing I remembered was the sound of slow, raspy breathing, coming from right next to me. The next morning, the house was quiet, too quiet, except for the soft clinking of dishes in the kitchen as Grandma prepared breakfast. She didn't notice right away. She thought maybe I had just slept in, tired from the long day before. But when she called me for breakfast and I didn't answer, she frowned, wiping her hands on her apron and heading down the hallway towards the small room at the end. When she opened the door, the sight that greeted her froze her in place. The bed was empty. The covers were rumpled like I had been tossing and turning all night, but I was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was something far more chilling. A large, dark stain spread across the sheets, soaking into the mattress. A deep crimson stain that could only be blood. Grandma's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the stain, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She rushed forward, pulling back the covers as if I might still be hiding beneath them, but there was nothing. Just that terrible, thick smear of blood. No sign of me anywhere. Her hands trembled as she backed out of the room, heart racing. She called out for Jeremy and Ellie, her voice shaking, trying to keep the panic from seeping into her tone. When they came running, still groggy from sleep, their eyes widened in horror when they saw the bloodstain. "Where is he?" Jeremy asked, his voice cracking. He was pale, the usual cockiness gone from his face. Ellie didn't say anything, just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, as if she could shield herself from the terror creeping into the room. I don't know," Grandma whispered, her voice barely a whisper. "I checked everywhere, but he's just gone." Panic quickly set in. She called the police, frantic, but when they arrived they found no trace of me. No footprints, no broken windows, nothing that would suggest I had left the house. It was as if I had vanished into thin air. All that remained was that horrible bloodstain on the bed, growing darker and more ominous with every passing second. By midday, Grandma couldn't take it anymore. She packed up Jeremy and Ellie and sent them straight to their parents. The look on her face was one of pure desperation. She needed them out of the house, away from the scene of whatever horror had taken place. She didn't know what was happening, but she feared that whatever had taken me might come for them next. When Jeremy and Ellie arrived back home, their parents were already waiting, faces tight with worry. Their father, a stern man who rarely showed fear, looked shaken. Their mother had red, swollen eyes from crying, and she clutched a handkerchief in her hands as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Where is he? What happened?" their mother asked as soon as she saw them, her voice trembling. "We don't know," Jeremy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He disappeared. There was blood but no body. He's just gone." Their father sat down heavily at the kitchen table, running a hand over his face. He didn't know what to say. No one did. It was like a dark cloud had settled over their home, the weight of something unspeakable pressing down on all of them. The boy they had all teased, the boy they had left alone in that room was gone. And no one could explain how. That evening Jeremy and Ellie, despite the horror of the morning, decided to go for a walk. Maybe they just needed to clear their heads. Maybe they couldn't stand being in the house, where every corner seemed to whisper reminders of the missing boy. The sun had set by the time they left, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. They walked in silence for a while, their shoes scuffing the pavement. Neither of them wanted to talk about what had happened, but the weight of it hung between them like a thick fog. Eventually, though, Jeremy broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "He probably just ran away," he said, kicking at a stone. "Maybe he got scared and took off. He'll show up sooner or later. You know how he was always afraid of everything." Ellie forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Yeah, probably. He'll come back and everyone will feel stupid for freaking out." But even as they laughed, they didn't dare look at each other. Deep down they both knew something was wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. They kept walking, their footsteps carrying them further and further away from the streetlights and into the park. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying in the cool night breeze. The park was empty at this hour, the playground and picnic tables swallowed by darkness. As they wandered deeper into the park, they saw something strange out of the corner of their eyes. A small figure, standing near the edge of the path, almost too faint to see, like a shadow blending into the night. It was white, translucent, and small. Jeremy stopped, squinting into the darkness. Do you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking now. Ellie nodded, her heart racing. The figure turned slowly, and as it did, they both sucked in sharp breaths. It was me. But not as they remembered. My face was pale, almost glowing under the faint moonlight, and my eyes, those same eyes they had laughed at for being so full of fear, were hollow, empty. My small frame seemed to flicker like a candle flame in the wind, my body barely solid, barely there. Before either of them could move, I began to walk towards them. My feet made no sound on the grass, and my eyes locked onto theirs, unblinking, cold. Jeremy's breath caught in his throat. What the hell?" he stammered, taking a step back. But it was too late. Without a second thought, I lunged forward, faster than either of them could react. My small, ghostly hands reached out, and the last thing they saw was my face, twisted in a grotesque mixture of rage and sorrow, before everything went black. The next morning, the park was silent, save for the early morning birds chirping in the trees. It wasn't until much later that someone stumbled across them. Two bodies, lifeless and cold, lying in the grass. Their eyes were wide open, mouths twisted in silent screams, their faces pale as death. Jeremy and Ellie had never made it home. When the police came, they found no signs of foul play. No injuries, no struggle. Just the two bodies lying side by side as if they had simply stopped breathing. The only strange thing was the look of pure terror frozen on their faces. Later that day, their parents heard from a neighbor who had been walking his dog through the park that morning. He had seen something strange, a small, pale figure standing near where the bodies were found. It looked like a boy, he said, but there was something wrong with it. Something not quite human. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the dead behind.